I think that empathy is DEI and DEI is empathy. I think that if we're making an effort to truly engage and connect with people across difference, that's understanding difference. That's understanding how to be more inclusive. That's understanding equity. If I'm listening to my colleague who has a different experience than me, then I know how to better engage that person.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. One of my mantras is that success is built on luck, mindset, and skill, in that order. And throughout my life, I've been lucky to have encountered empathetic, compassionate people, teachers, family, friends, bosses, and clients who've seen me as an individual who brings unique gifts and challenges to every interaction. And I've tried, with varying levels of success, to model that in my interactions. In fact, one of Imperative's 3 core values is always work as one with compassion and respect. Over the last 4 years, empathy and compassion have loomed large in conversations around talent attraction and retention. Joining me today to discuss the importance of empathy in the workplace is my friend, Dr. Wendy Williams. Wendy is a professor in the Honors College at Texas Christian University. She teaches empathy, mindfulness, and literature to college students and has published a number of articles and is the author of the nonfiction book, George Eliot, Poetess. She also delivers training to help business leaders create high-trust work environments that attract and keep top talent and increase productivity and profits. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Wendy.
Thanks, Mike. I'm so happy to be here.
So first, I'd like to start with the subject of your book, which isn't HR related, but you wrote a book about George Eliot, and I haven't read it in years, but Middlemarch is really one of those impactful books that is worth revisiting. Eliot has a way of making otherwise unsympathetic characters kind of sympathetic because you understand and empathize with how they got to where they are. And another book that's really similar to that I really love is Maud Flanders. And you're watching her do her best in really bad circumstances. And she makes some not so wise decisions and you're pulling your hair out. But the way Daniel Defoe wrote her, you understand how she got into the positions where she's making some of the decisions that she makes in those circumstances. So what do you think literature has to teach us about empathy?
Mike, that's a great question. So I'm teaching Middlemarch right now, and I'm scared to teach Middlemarch to Gen Z students because it's such a big book. But every time I teach it, I see that the students can relate to this 19th century work of literature. And it is because George Eliot is a master of transporting readers into the minds of her characters. And you're exactly right. The characters that are unsavory, the ones that are very unlikable, she lets us inside those minds to see, okay, I kind of understand where this person is coming from. It's not okay what this person has done, but I sort of get it. So I think that that's the power of literature, great literature. And there's a lot of studies that have been done. There's some of them were controversial, but there are studies that have been done that show that people who read great literature, like Middlemarch, are more empathetic. So that is why I have followed her and studied her for all of these years and wrote my book on her.
So let's talk about that term empathy. What's your definition of empathy?
Mine is different than the average definition. So I teach empathy at TCU to the honors students in upper division course. And we have a whole unit on defining empathy, and all of the disciplines define empathy differently. I suppose the most common understanding of empathy is stepping into someone else's shoes or taking someone else's perspective. I do not believe it is possible to do either of those things because my experiences, my identity, my world, my inner world are very different than everybody else's. And so is yours. So I define empathy as perspective seeking rather than perspective taking. So it's the effort that counts. It's my desire to know who you are better. And I have to ask you good questions, open questions to understand and to really listen by using supportive versus shifting responses so that I can draw more out of you. So this is a lot of what I do in my trainings is to teach people those skills of developing connection and trust through empathetic listening.
And that's interesting because you always hear, walk a mile in another man's shoes, but my feet are the wrong size to walk in that person's shoes. And so I think what you're saying is, we can, we make a lot of assumptions without asking questions, without really digging deep. We just assume, okay, well, they're like that because of this and this. And so we feel like we've got that connection or we've got that, and I think that's a big problem with a lot of hiring managers. They think they've got this unique insight into the human soul and they're, without exploring it, making decisions about either who they select as employees or how they manage those employees. And they don't really understand, they haven't taken the time to explore and try to at least understand why somebody sees the world the way they do and why they respond in certain circumstances the way they do.
Right. And people in the workplace are so busy. Who has time to sit down and have a one-on-one with an employee and get to know them? It's just the workday is so packed, and to take that time just seems overwhelming. But it's absolutely necessary to make those connections and to make people feel valued, to make people feel like they have a sense of belonging, to make them feel like they're part of a team, because without that, they're not going to stay. They're going to find somewhere else. Right. And especially Gen Z, my students, they want a different workplace than my generation or even the millennial generation wanted or expected. And so I think that they are really demanding a different kind of workplace and one that involves empathy.
So what role does compassion, which is part of one of our values, play in empathy?
So compassion is, people interchange the words pity, sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And I like to have my students or my organizational teams pay attention to the differences between these. I think that compassion is really defined as the work involved in relieving somebody else's suffering. So it may or may not involve understanding that person, but it involves doing something to make somebody feel better. So a lot of people might think of, healthcare providers as being compassionate people because they are alleviating other people's suffering. They don't necessarily need to understand where that other person is coming from to do that.
Interesting. Okay. And you mentioned pity. Where does pity fall into that range?
Pity is at the very bottom of the pyramid of understanding. It is to feel sorry for someone, but not feel compelled to engage with them. So I might give an example of someone passing a person who's living in a homeless situation, and they might go, "Oof, that's tough to be you. I hope you get what you need." That's pity. Sympathy, and again, everybody defines these terms differently. My definition of sympathy is to be affected by somebody else's emotional state, to feel for them. Maybe you don't do anything, but you feel for them. And then empathy, my definition of empathy is to understand or identify with somebody else's experience or state. And empathy can be cognitive or affective. Cognitive is understanding. And affective is feeling. So there are different kinds of empathy. And so I always say to my teams and my students, all of these definitions, they can get really murky because researchers are defining them differently across disciplines. And I don't think it really matters. I think what matters is to take on the skills that are absolutely attainable and employing them on a day-to-day basis at work, at home. And that not only makes relationships better, but it alleviates personal distress as well.
So that is so interesting. So now I'm going to have to rethink our value, because I really think what I'm calling compassion is what you're calling empathy, and that's really what I want. So okay,
That's
so
okay. You can call it
my
what you
senior
want
team,
to.
but I think maybe it makes more sense to talk about it that way. So over the pandemic and then all the heightened attention to race and class in the U.S. over the last 4 years, empathy has just really taken center stage. When we're in a crisis, whether it's a social crisis or a business or personal crisis, how can empathy help us in these larger macro issues? So it's not just strictly interpersonal. Navigate those kind of crises.
Well, I work more on with interpersonal
Mm-hmm.
relationships, the one-on-one or the small groups, the teams. So what you're asking is really a big question. And there are some people like Paul Bloom who
Mm-hmm.
would say, let's not even try to do empathy as we know it to be, because if we do that, then we're going to be tribal and we're going to have an us versus them mentality. And we're going to care about people in our group and not care about people outside of our group. And that's a really good argument. But I think also that I think we can think about empathy more broadly as well. But I think that we do need to step more toward compassion rather than the understanding part of empathy. Relieving the suffering of other people or other groups of people is something that I feel like we are duty bound to do. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to understand them. So I think that during the pandemic and with all of the race issues, this was the first time that a lot of people had to think about and really face their own prejudices in a really painful way. And I think that because this was so forefront in the news and in our lives, in discussions all around, we as a society had to think about empathy for other groups. I won't say for the first time, but for the first time in a long time, perhaps. And I think that a lot of people who are in those disenfranchised groups since have felt, again, disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a mentality of caring about people who are in groups that we're not in, I think that we can work together to make society better. But it's hard. It's hard to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And so inside of an organization, then maybe a smaller scale. So we're not talking the total macro environment, but inside my organization, we're in some sort of crises. How
Mm-hmm.
does is empathy purely at that point a matter of interpersonal one-to-one, or can you talk about building an organization, building empathy
Mm-hmm.
into an organization? So how does empathy help with change management or worst case scenario crisis management
Mm-hmm.
in an organization?
Yes. So in my training, I talk about two different types of communication: out of conflict communication and in conflict communication. And what I strive to do is help teams work together when there's no conflict present at all. And then if they're doing empathic listening and they're doing team building exercises and they're working to form connections, then there's a trust that's built. If that trust isn't there, there's very likely a toxic environment, some level of a toxic environment. And that can lead to crisis. So ideally, we build trust first, and then we have some skills to work through conflict. If I'm going into an organization and the culture is, not what maybe the leadership wants it to be, then we have to kind of take a few steps backwards before we can address the conflict, because we have to really build trust first before people are going to buy into even engaging the conflict.
So leadership, it's got to still start with leadership and that level of trust that they've earned from their relationships with the rest of the organization.
Ideally, yes. I do work with teams too.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes leadership doesn't buy in to the empathy. Sometimes empathy seems like a smushy term and people don't know what to do with it and they think it's going to make them appear weak. CEOs oftentimes have a distance between themselves and the people who work for them because They surround themselves with yes people, and there's not anybody to tell them, hey, can you think about things from this perspective? So sometimes there is a distance there that it's a gap that's hard to merge. So it is possible to better a work environment with teams, especially if the middle managers are on board. The middle managers are the reason that people leave usually. So even if the people in the C-suite are not on board, it's still doable to have a team course correct, or create the type environment that they want to create. And it really is up to every single person on that team to work together to create the environment they want. So I go in, I have tools to give them, but they have to employ them.
So when I was younger in my career, a long time ago, as far back as my internship, I really lacked empathy. And in fact, to this day, I get a knot in my stomach when I think about a time as an intern where I made my director's administrative assistant cry. She had made a mistake multiple times, and I said something very unkind about it as a snotty-nosed 20-year-old. And whatever else was going on in her life, that was the snapping point. She broke down crying and all that. I think I've grown since then, and I've had my rough patches in life. I've been married. I've been a parent. I've been an entrepreneur. So a lot of those experiences have happened. But beyond just life experience, you're saying we can actually teach people to be empathetic and not have it feel like it's just going through the motions or, play acting.
Yes, there's a lot of research on this idea of empathy. Is it innate or is it learned? And the answer is yes, it's both. Some of us are born with a greater capacity and some with a lesser. And I try to impart the idea that it's not better or worse to be anywhere on the empathy spectrum, unless, of course, you're a sociopath. That's not good. But if you are born with a lesser degree of empathy, you can still attain skills to engage people in a way that's going to create a high trust environment. And if you have too much empathy, that can be problematic. So that can lead to compassion fatigue or empathic distress. And then you're not able to, help anybody else under those circumstances. So yes, absolutely. I think that probably the most important part of becoming empathetic. And by the way, Mike, thanks for sharing that story, because everybody has plenty of stories like that, but we don't like to share that with other people, right? We like to think, we tend, in general, humans tend to think of themselves a little bit better than we actually are. So I appreciate your vulnerability.
I think I still suffer from that, just to be honest. My wife will tell you that, yeah.
Yeah, so vulnerability is key to empathy, and also so is mindset. And I think that it's really important to understand negativity bias and how we're hardwired to think negatively about other people for the purpose of self-preservation. Mm-hmm. We create these self-protective stories. We had to on the savannah, we have to now. And in those self-protective stories, the other person is the perpetrator typically, and we are the victim. We magnify our own fault, our own worthiness, and we magnify their faults. So because we do this, it is hard to engage empathetically because we're too busy blaming the other person. So key to learning empathy is self-awareness, learning one's core values, core fears, coping strategies, understanding when those self-protective stories are coming in and making us think negatively about other people, and then catching ourselves and go, hey, maybe I don't need to think this way. Maybe I can think this other way. And so there are strategies to doing that. There's common humanity outlook. There's gratitude thinking. There's mindfulness. And my favorite, benefit of the doubt thinking. So if we can tune in to our own negativity when we're in those crises or conflicts, and then tune out and shift toward that other person, there's a better chance that we're going to be able to engage the conversation in productive ways.
One of my early and long-time coaches who's since passed away was a lady named Nancy Starr. And Nancy would always say, whenever you engage in, whether it's self-doubt or a negative emotion about somebody else, stop and ask yourself, what else could be true?
Mm-hmm.
And she said it enough times that it's hardwired now. And so I ask
That's
myself
great.
that, probably several times a day, because I can be an impatient person. And I'm very type A. I'm very, results driven, very intuitive. So I see the answer before I even understand, how to get from the problem to the answer. I just know and so when I'm working with my team or even clients, sometimes I'm like, they're just being belligerent. Why don't they and so I hear that, hear Nancy ask, what else could be true? And that for me has been a transformative question to ask in my marriage with my kids, and certainly in business.
I love that. What else could be true? That's brilliant. That is giving somebody else the benefit of the doubt, whether or not you understand where they're coming from. I like to give the example of the person who cuts us off in traffic. There's no way to know why that person did that. We can think negatively toward that other person, that they're just a jerk, they don't care about anybody else, or we can come up with what else could be true. Maybe that person is just having an awful day. Maybe they had a fight at home. Maybe they're rushing to the ER. Who knows? And we'll never know in that instance, will we?
Right.
But if we say what else could be true and we give that other person the benefit of the doubt, they're doing the best they can, even if it's unacceptable. They're doing the best they can. And I'm going to just extend a little bit of grace in my mind toward that person. It helps me, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. Why do I want to carry all of this about somebody else?
Yeah. I think benefit of the doubt thinking is one of my favorite parts of empathy, because this is one thing that I've learned from this training that I do. It is, in my mind, I thought, I'm going to go into these organizations and I'm going to help them fix their workplace culture. And I think I am. The data shows that it's working well, which is great. But what really excites me is that I'm seeing personal suffering is being alleviated. When someone chooses to think the way that you just described, what else could be true? Or, if said in the other way, giving the benefit of the doubt, it makes them feel better. And so not only does it make me able to have the harder conversation, but it also makes me feel better before I have that conversation. So I can have my 10-year-old daughter might be yelling at me because she doesn't want to eat her vegetables. And I can just shut her down and say, I'm the parent, eat your vegetables or you're not going to get to have dessert. So with my daughter, I'm thinking, you're being unreasonable and I'm just going to order you to do what I want you to do. Right. But then if I say, okay, she's probably not just being a bratty kid just to be a bratty kid. I don't really know where she's coming from, but let me just take a moment to ask her, where are you coming from with this anger? And can we, maybe put this conversation on pause for 5 minutes and come back to it when you feel a little bit cooler? And then ask some questions. What's going on in your world? Can you give me some more information? And just pause to find out what's going on behind that bad behavior. And then I can go, okay, I understand where you're coming from. You're still going to eat your vegetables, but let's compromise. Let's talk about, how we can make this palatable for you or what you get afterwards. And then it becomes a conversation and it's not a digging in anymore.
Right. Well, and I think that ties into, when I talk to leaders and they don't want to have personal relationships or close connection with their employees because they're concerned that when they have to make a hard decision, a difficult decision, mm-hmm. That will interfere with that they, either they won't have, they'll look, it'll seem contradictory to their previous behavior. They'll look like hypocrites, or it'll just be hard on them personally to make the business decision that needs to be made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think transparency is one of the things that all team members want, and one of the things that leaders have to really think hard about how to do, because it's not the case that you want to tell absolutely everything to everybody. But it's important to be transparent enough that people feel that they're a part of the decision making.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. We're dedicated to helping risk-averse clients make well-informed decisions about the people they involve in their business. If you don't absolutely love your background screening partner, maybe you don't have confidence in the quality of the information they're providing you, maybe the reports take too long without a reasonable explanation, or when you get a report, you have to Google stuff to figure out what they're talking about. Or maybe their customer service is just not what you deserve. If any or all of that sounds familiar, we'd love to help you explore your options. We're here to help at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 3/4 of a recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 120 and enter the keyword, you guessed it, empathy. That's EMPATHY. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Dr. Wendy Williams. So you mentioned Gen Z earlier and your current students and what their expectations are of what they what they really want in the workplace. What are they telling you? Well, first, tell me how the students have changed. As students, how are they different today than they were 5 years, 10 years ago? And then what is their expectation of the workplace? Maybe that'll give us a on-ramp.
Yeah. So I remember a day that I was teaching a class called College Life and Identity. And I had the students reading an article and we were discussing it and they were unusually quiet. And I said to them, can you all check in with me? What's causing you not to engage this material like usual? And it occurred to me, I said, do you not relate to this millennial information and how millennials and Gen X interact? Mm-hmm. And they said, no. And I said, you're not millennials, are you? They said, no, we're Gen Z. And I said, I just watched an entire generation pass through my classroom. I feel old.
Tell me.
So first of all, it didn't occur to me how they were different, but it has since. And what I've noticed is they are more anxious, much more anxious. They grew up with Gen X, our generation, helicopter parenting or lawnmower parenting and figuring things out for them. And so their coping skills are a little bit less than maybe if we had thrown them out into the world and let them ride their bikes in the neighborhood like we did. Right. And I am guilty of this too. I am just like all the other parents who are overprotective, driving my kids everywhere and worrying about their well-being. And so I think that that kids, Gen Z, I shouldn't say kids, my students aren't kids, but Gen Z students and workers, they are a little bit less resilient. So that's a little bit of a negative, but I wouldn't say that they're entitled. People keep saying, a lot of people like to say that they're entitled and selfish. I don't think that's the case. This is the most civic-minded generation that I've come across. They're super savvy. They're very intelligent. They are creative. And really, maybe the most salient aspect is they really want to make a difference in the world. They want to make the world better. They want their values to match the values of the workplace. They want to know that their skills, their purpose, their passions match that of the organization and that they're purposeful, that they're a part of something really meaningful. Our generation wasn't quite like that. We just wanted to get a job and, maybe have a family and live a nice life. And I mean, I'm speaking for a whole generation.
Sure,
but
right.
I think, this is sort of the trend, I think. So greater anxiety, a little bit lesser resilience, but much better at civic engagement, caring about the purpose of the world and how they fit into that.
And that civic engagement, that seeking justice in the workplace, that kind of stuff, that all ties right back to that compassion, that empathy that you were talking about. So do you think that generation inherently has more empathy, or do they tend to have more compassion, or what is, if you're going to compare our generation, Gen X, we were supposed to be the slackers, eating pizza and smoking weed until we were 50, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but we didn't really engage as much with, we didn't think about, is there a social mission behind the work that I'm doing, for the most part, those kind of things. So where do you see that? Is it more empathetic, or is it something else?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I think that on an interpersonal level, they are no better or worse than other generations. I think on a global level, they probably are better, whether we call it empathy, compassion, or whatever, caring about the bigger picture. And I think that part of that comes from just caring about the earth itself and knowing that it's their responsibility to clean up our mess. So I think that maybe that's the reason that they are more civic minded. I'm not really sure.
That's interesting. And, since George Floyd's murder on May 25th of 2020, there's been a whole renewed interest in DEI, and we've covered it here several times. A lot of the DEI efforts that corporations have attempted have just not worked. They just flat, a lot of them were just strictly performative to start with. But it seems to me that empathy would really be, empathy skills would really be a difference maker in an organization's ability to truly, build belonging and inclusion inside the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know that DEI is a charged term these days, and I think that the thought behind DEI was really important and necessary. And I'm not sure why there is such negativity around it. I think it's really important that we all have DEI training. I think that a lot of people have felt a finger wagging when it comes to DEI training, and they've been made to feel guilty, whether that's right or wrong, that they should feel guilty.
Right.
I think that empathy is DEI and DEI is empathy. I think that if we're making an effort to truly engage and connect with people across difference, that's understanding difference. That's understanding how to be more inclusive. That's understanding equity. If I'm listening to my colleague who has a different experience than me, then I know how to better engage that person. And if I'm just sitting and someone's telling me what I need to be doing differently, then I'm going to feel chastised, perhaps. So not that all DEI training is bad. It certainly isn't. I've had some DEI training that was very informative. But I think that the most important thing is for us to make an effort and to care about people who are different from us.
Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of people who do care, but haven't been really given the tools to make a difference. And I think the kind of training you're talking about, and so let's talk through some of the skills that when you're working with a team, what are those skills? It certainly sounds like asking good questions, and I'd like to explore that a little bit. But what other skills too? But does a team or a leader really need in order to really achieve the enlightenment of empathy?
Yeah. So I have a 3-part training, and the first part is the what and why of empathy. And there's a lot of research, but it's not boring. People are scared of research, but it's really important to understand the why, right? Especially for leaders. If they don't understand that people are leaving for a certain reason, they're not going to know how to change that. And retention is a big issue, I know, in organizations. So the first part is the what and the why of empathy. And the second part is the mindset that we've talked about. So if I can tune in to what's going on in my own mind and then tune out or turn out toward other people, then I'm ready for the skills, the really practical skills. And the third of the training is practical skills, and it's all about communication. So first we do communication out of conflict, and that's all about asking questions and how to answer and how to listen, truly listening. Listening is probably the most important part of empathy. What we love to do, especially those of us who value our own intelligence and think we have important things to say, we will be thinking of the response that we want to say rather than truly listening to that other person. This is just one example. I mentioned support versus shift responses earlier. We tend to want to empathize by saying, oh, if it were me, or, oh, if I were you, I would. And it sounds like empathy, right? But it's false empathy. And it's coming from a good place. People are trying to relate, but actually we're taking the spotlight off of them and putting it on us.
And we're trying to solve their problem
yes,
rather than
fixing.
Understand. Yeah.
Exactly. We're trying to fix the problem, right? When really listening is the best way to make another person feel heard and understood. And sometimes the problem can't be solved by us or at all. But if we let that other person know, hey, I hear you, I'm listening to you, I care about you, that goes a long way. So that's listening out of conflict and really connecting. And we talk a lot about communication killers. What are those communication killers? Minimizing somebody else's experience, interrupting, thinking of your own ideas, avoiding or advising or fixing. These are examples of communication killers. So we avoid those. And then when we have developed good relationships, then we're ready for the conflict that comes. And so the conflict that comes, we do active listening, which is clarify, reflect, validate, which is nothing new, but we practice it in the work setting. And it seems basic, but it's not super easy to do all the time, especially when your emotions are charged. When we're in conflict, our bodies are in a different state, right? Our amygdala is hard at work. Our heartbeat is racing. So we talk about how to kind of bring that down before we meticulously work through the steps of active listening. The very last step of active listening is sharing and solving. So I'm going to understand where you're coming from through questions, clarifying questions, reflecting and validating before I'm going to say my piece at all. And then when it's time for me to say my piece, I'm going to use what I call problem-solving language. And that means I'm going to use I statements instead of you statements. I'm going to say could instead of should. I'm going to say and instead of but. I'm going to be specific and clear rather than vague and unclear. So there's a list of things that I'm going to, just basic skills that I'm going to remember because I've practiced them in training. And then when it comes down to it, then I'm ready for that actual event to take place. So they're very practical skills.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that I've trained myself to do or been trained by experience, I think, and good coaching is to end that conversation after this person has explained where they're coming from, what their challenge really is. Maybe I'm asking questions that peel the onion a little bit and get deeper into what's going on. And then before I offer a solution, because that's what I'm hardwired to do. I mean, I just want to solve, the reason I'm an entrepreneur is because I wanted to solve people's problems. I get that one of my personal values is earned appreciation. And I mean, I write it right there and it sounds so vain because, I want, but I want to, I want to solve people's problems. But one of the things I've learned to ask before I start jumping in there is what can I give right now that would be helpful in this? Mm-hmm. What would be helpful to you? And let them say what. Sometimes I've been married 27 years in January. I've learned that my job is not to solve the problems. Often my job is to hear, make sure that my lovely wife is feels like she's been heard, and and maybe that's all she needs. Maybe she needs me to ask some questions gently that help her better understand her circumstances. 9 times out of 10, what she doesn't want is, well, here's what you should do, and I have to bite my tongue often because it's so hardwired in me. But if I can just say, what do you need from me right now? That gives them the opportunity to tell me what they want and how they'd like me to help.
Absolutely. Good questions are so important. And asking a question like, what can I do, is just wide open. Open questions rather than closed questions are great. Questions that invite as much information, clarifying information, great. Questions that don't invite a I'm fine or yes or no, those are great. So the one that you've offered is an excellent question. In the workplace, what can I do to make me better to work with? What can I stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? How can I support you? What can I do for you? Tell me about what's going on in your life, in this work life, not necessarily your personal life.
For sure.
What's going on in your work life that is challenging? These are great open questions that will lead to the information that we need to support other people.
Yeah, even in performance discussions, the question that I coach the leaders who report to me to work when they're working with their teams is okay, so here's the performance expectations. Let's reset those.
Great.
What do you need from us to help you achieve those? And it's still on you. You're not going to screw the monkey on my back. I'm not going to do your work for you, but if there's something that you need that we can provide, we'll do it. I mean, my leader's job is to make their team successful, right? And so if it's within budget and it's reasonable and all of that, and it will truly be impactful, that's what we want. But if even if it's the same thing that the manager or the supervisor would have said, if the employee asked for it, it came out of their mouth, I think it's more meaningful. And when they're provided that, it doesn't feel like it doesn't take away their agency. They asked for it and we gave it to them rather than defining the solution for them.
Absolutely. The word empowering was in my mind as you were saying that. It is empowering to be able to say, this is what I need, and to have that need met by leadership. It makes people feel like, oh, I have some power. I have some agency. I matter. They've listened to me. It's very powerful.
This conversation ties in really well with an episode we did a couple months ago with Monica Guzman. Are you familiar with her book, Curious Conversations?
Oh, yes.
And so
yes.
I'm going to tie those together in the notes. But we're out of time, but I really do appreciate you joining us today, Wendy.
This has been such a pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.